So hello everyone, in case you haven't watched the depression series, please have a look because in this session we will be talking about a case study of a 24-year-old Paul, and we will talk in different case studies. This one is the second case study which John McNally has prepared for us. So let's see what we have as a case. Paul is a 24-year-old unemployed warehouse worker who is currently sleeping on his brother's couch. He lost his job 2 months ago because he was either absent or late for work too many times. He lives on government social assistance and spends his days mostly playing video games, contributing little to the household work. Paul says he has always been a bit lazy and unmotivated to work and dropped out of high school early to just hang out with friends. He has picked up various labor jobs but is rather disinterested in them and either gets fired or he just stops going. He wonders if he is depressed because nothing seems to make him happy. His parents divorced when he was 14 and he lived with his mother and rarely saw his father after that. His brother, who is 3 years older, moved out at that time. His mother continued to work and provide for him but seemed emotionally unavailable. He withdrew and started using cannabis on a regular basis. Paul has few friends, no partner, and generally they only get together to go drinking. He sleeps about 12 hours a day, and since he often doesn't get dressed, he also showers infrequently. His diet is mostly fast foods and he doesn't like to cook. Sometimes when he's gaming, he forgets to eat. He has no real interest in the world and often feels alone and alienated. He does not exercise. Paul has difficulty expressing emotions but says he's bored and unhappy. He knows he can't keep doing this but lacks energy and motivation to change, so he just keeps doing the same things. He feels things are hopeless. Paul drinks about 3 drinks daily, although on weekends he will drink to get drunk. He uses cannabis daily and has on occasion used crack cocaine, MDMA, and whatever else is available. 2 years ago, he tried antidepressant medication for a few weeks but didn't feel any change, so he stopped. Paul says he frequently feels like committing suicide. He uses drugs and alcohol to cope but sometimes thinks of hanging himself. He knows this will really hurt his brother and mother, so denies any real intent and has not developed any actual plans. There is no history of attempts. So let's see what our clinical psychologist here to say.
So as I explained in the last video, that I'm collecting information as the person goes by asking questions and just writing down in rough notes what's going on, which I later then form into about a page-long sort of synopsis of what it is. If you go to a psychiatrist or a psychologist, it is likely they will get much more information and they will often write 8 to 10 pages for their initial report in order to come up with the diagnosis. Because of the nature of the treatment method I'm using, which is transdiagnostic, what that essentially means is the diagnosis doesn't really matter in order for me to do the treatment. So I pay less attention to the details of the diagnosis. What I need is the storyline behind the person so that I can understand what's going on in their world and what's causing the most suffering, where it's coming from. If you look at the whole thing, the first paragraph always addresses 3 things: what they're doing in general in the world, so there's sort of situation, whether they've got adequate housing, and whether they've got money to buy food and other necessities. So the reason I address that is, the reason I talk about that at the front end is because if that's a problem, then getting at the depression piece will be secondary to solving that problem. So basically, if you haven't got a stable place to stay, if you can't put food in your mouth, those are going to be a priority for you. And although they're related to the depression, you need to solve those problems first. So the first paragraph covers those 3 basic things. In Paul's case, he's got a place to live, but it's not very permanent, right? It's kind of tentative. And he's got money coming in, but again, it's on social assistance, so he doesn't really have any stable work. So basically, if you haven't got a place to stay or you can't put food in your mouth, those are going to be a priority for you, and you're not going to be doing treatment on depression. So we have to address those issues first, and then we'll get at the depression piece. If you look at the second paragraph, and it talks a little bit more about his work history, the fact that he drops out of school early, that he's just hanging out, that he takes on jobs but usually doesn't finish them or gets fired. What you're seeing is a progression of how he engages in the world. And you're seeing this earlier on. So although he's 24 now, he was doing this when he was still in high school. So 16, 17, 18 years of age, he was already in this habit. So we're seeing a pattern response. The next paragraph, we talk about why this occurs. So this is the triggering event. So his parents get divorced when he's 14. He loses his father. Virtually that relationship dissolves. And his brother leaves the house at that time. And his mother becomes, frankly, overworked and emotionally distant. So he's left all alone to pick up the pieces. And at 14, he hasn't figured out how to put all the pieces together. So he's struggling. So he falls into depression early. This leads to the other patterns, right? The dropping out of school, the starting to smoke cannabis. All of these things are sort of a progression from this main event. So we now know what triggered it, and we also know the pattern that's fallen since that time. The next one, he talks about generally how he's living in the world, so he's sleeping a lot, his hygiene isn't all that great, he's got a few friends, but they basically just go drinking, which is a coping strategy. He doesn't really do much of anything. He sort of feels hopeless. And all of this is easily explained if you just look at his history, right? He's not engaged in the world. The depression has sort of caged him off and is now controlling his behavior, and emotionally he just feels like there's no hope. We next look at his substance use. And in here, there's enough information for me to have a concern about it. He's drinking pretty much daily. He's using cannabis daily. He's doing other drugs. And when I see this type of presentation, in the back of my mind, I put a question mark because I don't know whether I've got substance use disorder in addition to the depression or whether the two are just melded together. So I'm not sure at this point. Since he's presenting with a depression problem, that's why he come to see me, that's the one I'm going to lead with. But I'm also going to keep in mind that I may have another problem over here to deal with. Lastly, we talk about suicidal ideation. In this case, he's thinking about suicide fairly frequently, and he knows that he wants to hang himself, so he's thought about it in some degree of detail, but he has not moved from this detail into doing anything. So he's thinking about it on the one hand, but not doing anything. So there is a risk here, so I need to monitor this because he's a little more heavily involved, and given his feelings of hopelessness and the fact that his day is just really not doing much of anything, it leads to sort of a tunnel from which he can get himself into some big trouble. So I need to start to question that. And in fact, in my summary, what I wrote is this. Paul is a 24-year-old man who is suffering from a major depressive disorder, query substance use disorder. That tells me that I need to keep this in mind as we go further on with treatment, because I need to find out whether this is really a problem we're going to need to address. In all likelihood, I can address it using the same techniques in CBT and just bring that into the depression, move it inside the depression symptoms, and get him to deal with it there. But it could be that this is actually the primary issue, and the depression is secondary. That is, the substance use is now causing him to stay stuck in depression, in which case I got to switch over to substance use as the main focus. Suicidality needs to be monitored, right? So that's an ongoing, that just tells me that I've got to keep this in mind as we continue on with treatment, because it could be that as we bring him out of depression more, he may feel he's in a better position to act out. So it may be that he's so depressed that he can't, he just can't get himself off the couch. He doesn't feel motivated to do anything. If we give him enough treatment, he starts to pull out, it could actually increase his suicidality. And then lastly, as I always say, the second part of the first session that I do a psychoeducational thing about cognitive behavioral therapy. I'll use the stuff he just told me, the stories he told me, to explain how they fit into the model. So he's going to see, he should leave with the idea that he can see the depression from a different angle. So he already has the experience of what it feels like to be depressed. I want him to look at depression from a different angle, in this case through the way his brain works. I think that's about it for this one.
I have a question, sir.
Yep, go ahead.
So let's say, because he has been in depression almost 10 years, as far as I can read from the notes, because his parents divorced with 14. Let's say it started regarding that point, and he's 24. So he might be depressed like 10 years. Can we say that just because he's from the teenage years until adulthood has been depressed, more or less, it's much more harder to get out of depression?
Yeah, this is a good question. So not necessarily is the answer. So what you have is a pattern response. So the brain has now internalized the pattern. So it will, on an ongoing basis, be looking into the world for evidence to support the depression. So Paul's going to be interpreting his world in a way that allows him to maintain the depression. That's his story that he's going to tell himself. All right? So all the 10 years means, as opposed to someone who just started last week, is the pattern's been reinforced. So the pattern's more stubborn.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean it's harder to get rid of. It's actually just as hard for everyone. So it doesn't necessarily mean that, because he's going to require more effort. So what I'm doing when I'm talking to him and asking questions is I'm actually gauging that level of stickiness to the depression. So to what extent, when I'm asking questions, can I bring him out of the depression and get him to talk about something else where he's no longer feeling miserable in this moment? And as I'm able to do that, that's a better indicator of how stuck he is, as opposed to the number of years he's been in it.
Yeah.
So he could be in it, but there's this thing, it used to be called dysthymia. It's no longer in the diagnostic criteria, but dysthymia is essentially a low-grade depression, which people will function at. And then a major depressive episode, there are some people that we call them treatment resistant, because they go through the treatment and nothing seems to catch them. So there's degrees of stickiness about depression, how much you're stuck in it. And so what I'm trying to do, gauge in that first session, just by asking questions, is just whether or not I can sort of, by asking different questions about their life, I can watch them to see if I can pull their emotion out a bit, move them away from the depressive feeling. And I can just ask that, and then I can confirm with them, how are you feeling in this moment? By doing that, I get a feel for how stuck they are with the depressive and how much work it's going to take to get out. And then I'll just tell them. I'll just say, this is what I've been doing. This is what I'm seeing. So this is going to take some more effort. So you need to think in terms of a longer-term strategy with me rather than just a few sessions, because it's going to take a little harder to wedge yourself out.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yes, definitely. Okay.
Any questions?
I'm thinking one thing is they kind of like living like a relationship with the depression. I have this feeling kind of, because it's part of their life now. It's a strong part of their life.
Yeah.
It's almost like in the core of their life is depression.
Yep.
Do they experience like that? The depression is very dominant in their life?
Yeah, that's usually one of the variables. So in terms of level of functioning, so the story they're going to tell themselves is that it is the dominant thing in their life. What their lived experience will be slightly different than this. For example, they will say that they're just depressed all the time. So the moment you go to all the time, it means there's no other option, 100% in one direction.
But it's impossible, isn't it, to be depressed 7/24?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And in fact, they're not depressed all the time.
Yeah.
So when I'm talking to them and getting all the questions from them, I'm actually watching for evidence to tell me when they're depressed, because I can watch the way they present in the moment. So I'm actually going to look for the evidence that proves that they're not there 100% of the time. And then I'm going to bring it back and show them what this looks like. Because there's going to be an incongruency with the story they tell themselves and the actual evidence on the ground. And I'm going to use that evidence to start to break apart that story that they're telling themselves. And the story is based on what we call cognitive distortions, which is the way that we distort the evidence in order to maintain the belief that we're depressed all the time.
Unbelievable.
This is how our brain works. This is what we do.
That's really unbelievable.
So then I'm going to use that evidence to start to break apart that story.
Yeah.
And that's what the treatment ultimately is. It's just maneuvering things back onto the evidence.
So that was it for today, I would say.
Yeah, it's good.
Yep. Thank you very much for watching, everyone. And we will be meeting you in the anxiety session.
Coming up next.
Yeah. Please subscribe and like. And if you have any questions which I didn't direct to John, please note in the comments. We will be answering those. Thank you very much and see you soon.
Bye-bye now.